Hi guys, we're back, and this time we're going to talk about trophic systems, which is basically a fancy word for the food chain and kind of interactions and passing matter and energy through the way that different organisms eat, which basically is capturing energy and passing energy um, in different ecological systems. So let's look at some slides to help us understand. We know ecosystems are these interactive systems where there's these interdependent components of living organisms and non-living components. They pass energy from one compartment in the system to the next compartment in the system. And that can be through different kinds of chemical reactions that we talked about. And we can organize our thinking about these systems into different trophic levels. So we can think about different biological communities within ecosystems that exist within these different trophic levels. And these are basically different levels that have similar relationships with how they gain and pass energy and matter around the ecosystem. So we could also think of these as like feeding groups. So first of all, we have different kinds of decomposers, organisms that gain their energy from dead and dying organisms. Then we have primary producers, which are basically like mostly plants. And those are organisms that are able to capture energy from the sun and transform that into a form of organic energy. And then we have different kinds of consumers that eat plants, and then organisms that eat first level consumers, and so on and so forth. So each of those are considered to be different trophic levels. And the primary producers, those organisms that capture the non-organic energy from sunlight and transform it into organic energy, that's considered trophic level 1. And then the organisms on top are considered in higher trophic levels. So in general, an important ecological concept is that these trophic systems, or the trophic levels within the trophic systems, are very interconnected. And there is an idea, which is something that's called a trophic cascade. And basically what that is when we have a change to one set of organisms or one particular like species that is a prominent player in a particular trophic level, then it not only affects those organisms, but because these systems are so interconnected, it has a cascade of different effects, kind of like dominoes all falling over, that influences all the other organisms in the different levels, because the way that energy and matter are transferred are so interconnected. So a classic example is on the California coast back a couple hundred years ago, as European Americans came to the coast of California and the coast of Oregon and Washington and British Columbia. They were very interested in hunting for sea otters because they were really interested in the pelts of the sea otters that they use for hats and other things. And so there was this huge crash in the sea otter population as they were being very aggressively hunted. And then not only did that affect the sea otter population, but sea urchins, which are normally a major food source for sea otters, started to boom as their predators, the sea otters that were normally eating them, were being decimated. So there was a change not only in the sea otter population, but then in the sea urchin population. And then sea urchins that were starting to boom started to aggressively eat kelp. And sea urchins are animals that always eat kelp, but normally their population was a lot smaller. So as their population started to boom, they started to really decimate the kelp. And the kelp, you may or may not know, is an important component that forms the whole kelp forest, or the whole ecosystem where all these organisms were living. So as the kelp started to die off, it was having really negative effects on all the other kinds of organisms that were normally living in that ecological system. And so what we saw was that humans were only coming in and messing with one organism at one trophic level, but then it had these cascading effects on lots and lots of other organisms within the system. So this is true of lots of different trophic systems. You may have also heard about the idea of a keystone species. So in this case, an otter is really a keystone species. meaning that the presence of that otter really, and a healthy population of that otter is really important to hold the whole ecosystem together. There's really no other organisms that fill that same ecological niche or that same role in the ecosystem. So anyway, this is just an example of how trophic systems are very interconnected. Okay, so let's kind of think about all the different trophic levels one by one and dive into some more details about them. So as we already said, the first level of this trophic system, level 1, is considered those organisms that we call primary producers. So these are defined as the organisms, again, mostly plants and bacteria as well, that can create their own bioavailable form of chemical potential energy. So all other organisms need to eat, or at least absorb, energy in some sort of organic form from a different organism. But plants don't have to do that. They take their energy directly from the sun, and then they use that energy to form the same kinds of chemical potential energy that the rest of us also use. It's just that we can't make our own and plants can. That's what photosynthesis allows them to do. So as we learned earlier, the sun, the energy from the sun and the right photosynthetic tools that have evolved in plants allow them to convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen. Glucose is that chemical potential energy that can be burned with oxygen. It can be combusted to release the energy that's allows plants to live and survive and grow and do cellular respiration, etc. So there's actually other organisms that complete a very similar process to photosynthesis, meaning that they're also primary producers. They don't have to ingest organic compounds from other organisms. And those organisms do a process that's called chemosynthesis, which does not require the light from the sun, which is that photo component. Many evolutionary biologists think that chemosynthesis was probably actually the first way that different producers evolved to capture energy in our environment, and photosynthesis actually came later, although that's a very dominant process among producers today. But there still are environments, extreme environments, like in a volcanic vent or in a hydrothermal vent at the bottom of the ocean, where chemosynthesis takes place and provides the original organic compounds that form the basis of the ecosystem rather than photosynthesis. So in this case, they use other kinds of oxidizers like sulfur or hydrogen sulfide gas, and then they use that they split those compounds to create thermal energy. And so they get their energy from splitting other chemicals rather than from capturing energy from the sun. So these hydrothermal vents, which you may have seen pictures of before, are these kind of bizarre and really magical types of ecosystems that exist deep down in the ocean, where it's very, very dark and there's not energy available from the sun. But despite that, there's this whole different system of other trophic levels that exist with primary producers that are doing chemosynthesis, that are below other levels of consumers that consume energy from them. So I'll include some links for this week with the video lectures for you to be able to view these hydrothermal vent videos and learn a little bit about how that works. So be sure to check that out as well. Okay, so how does photosynthesis work? Well, in today's world, the way that photosynthesis works is that these different chlorophyll compounds, which are different proteins, which are organic compounds, they take red and blue light absorbed from the sun. They can't use the green light, so they bounce that green light back out, which is why plants look green to us. That's kind of, the green light is essentially like a waste product, a waste energy product. And they take the light in the red part of the spectrum and the light in the blue part of the spectrum, and they can use that to convert carbon dioxide and water to sugar. And the sun's, as the sun's energy is converted into chemical energy, it's not done particularly efficiently. So for example, photovoltaic cells, which are in solar panels, are able to convert about 10% of the energy that arrives at a solar panel into some sort of energy that we can capture, whereas plants are usually doing that at less than 3% efficiency. So that's just interesting. It's still an incredible evolutionary tactic that plants have access to. But later on in the class, when we're thinking about energy systems, it's interesting to know that plants, and so that therefore biofuels, are not a particularly efficient way to capture energy that's coming to our planet from the sun. Okay, so when we think about primary producers, one important metric that scientists and ecologists often think about is productivity. So productivity is basically a measure of the amount of biomass that's produced in a given area for a given time. So biomass is basically just the mass, the amount of matter that, again, we typically would measure as the weight of the organic material that's produced by living organisms. So like if a tree is growing, we could weigh the tree. If grass is growing, we could clip the grass and weigh the grass. And then we can think about either how much gross primary productivity has occurred or how much net primary productivity has occurred. So those are often abbreviated as GPP or NPP. So gross primary productivity is just the total amount of biomass that's produced by producers over a given time. So the total amount of grass that's grown over the summer season. But that's also doesn't really account for the way that a lot of that grass is going to be either eaten or decomposed over the course of a year, for instance, or 6 months, for instance, or 10 years, whatever time frame you're looking at. And so another common ecological metric is NPP, net primary productivity, that measures how much biomass is produced and then compares that to the amount that's lost by consumption, by like herbivores, and then by decomposition by different kinds of decomposers. And in a very stable ecosystem, we might have a zero net primary productivity where things are growing, but things are also decomposing at a fairly equal rate. So we have this kind of dynamic equilibrium idea that we've talked about earlier. Whereas other systems may be experiencing net positive growth, net primary productivity. So they're actually expanding, or they might be experiencing negative net primary productivity, where the biomass is actually decreasing over time with different kinds of human impacts or climate impacts, or just evolutionary changes, et cetera. So productivity is an important metric about what's going on with primary producers and ecosystems. So since this class is all about not just the environment, but science, how we measure and understand the environment around us, I just want to mention that there's some interesting techniques that we can use to measure productivity in the environment. And a lot of this data is actually collected with satellite information and different kinds of what we would call remote sensing. So that's information that's collected basically from a remote position rather than from going out on the ground and actually cutting and weighing vegetation, for example. So that could be, again, data that's collected from like a satellite or a plane or a drone that's kind of flown over a particular area where productivity is being produced. So that might be a grassland or a forest. And basically, these different techniques look at the different kinds of wavelengths that are being emitted from these different systems. And so when we're talking about energy this week, so that might be different kinds of light wavelengths that are being emitted, different kinds of greens or colors of greens or amounts of greens, and then also different heat signatures that represent the amount of vegetation or the water content in vegetation. And generally, what we know from past testing is that living plant cells reflect quite a bit of infrared radiation and absorb quite a bit of visible light compared to non-living surfaces like rock or soil that absorb more infrared or heat radiation and reflect more visible light. And so a common way to try to assess how much biomass is existing, and then we can see how much productivity is occurring by looking at changes to biomass over time. But to measure biomass, we kind of commonly measure what's called the NDVI, or Normalized Difference of Vegetation Index, which is basically to look at the ratios between light and heat that are being emitted from different systems, and then try to kind of work backwards to figure out biomass content that way. So anyway, these are just different kinds of scientific techniques that allow us to try to capture and understand what's going on with primary producers. Okay, so above primary producers, there are different levels of consumers. So these consumers cannot produce their own forms of organic energy. They need to eat them. So we're very familiar with eating as humans. We are consumers, but there's other ways to consume that might not look exactly like what we think of as eating. So fungi can absorb different kinds of compounds from their environment, and bacteria can engulf and absorb different kinds of organic compounds from their environment. And that's considered consuming as well, even though it might look different than like eating a piece of pizza or eating an apple. And so these consumers consume either primary producers, or they consume other things that have consumed primary producers. So they can have that direct transfer of energy from primary producers, or more indirect transfer. And there's this really important ecological rule, which is called the 10% rule, which tells us that according to the second law of thermodynamics, which we also talked about last week, that there's a lot of energy that's lost at all these levels of transfer between different compartments in the ecosystem. So basically, our energy transfer as well as our matter transfer is not particularly efficient. And usually in the trophing, which is just a word for eating, or the transferring between these different trophic levels, about 90% of the energy and matter ends up being lost, and only about 10% is able to be transferred. So again, a lot of that loss of energy is going to heat. So when we eat a piece of pizza, we don't just get an extra amount of pizza mass and energy like stuck onto our bodies, but as our body tries to chew and eat and swallow and digest that pizza, it's doing a lot of work that's creating energy that's being lost to our environment. So we're losing a lot of that energy through heat. Thank goodness we don't need all that energy from that pizza. And then also, not all of that pizza is actually turned into cells. Of course, we lose some of that through waste products. So we're going to pee and poop. And so some energy is going to be contained within that pee and poop. And then also a lot of mass is going to be lost through that process. So we're not going to gain either the energy or the mass from the pizza. And then also just a lot of chemical respiration, just work in our body is, being used up through the processing of that pizza. So there's a lot of inefficiency in the passing of energy and matter between these compartments. And so only about 10% is passed from one level to another. So if we can think about this both in terms of energy and in terms of matter. But if we think about the amount of energy that's contained by primary producers, maybe in a particular field or meadow, maybe we could add that all up and find out that that's about 10,000 joules of energy contained by all the plants in a particular meadow. And then if we looked at all the primary consumers, those basically herbivores, those organisms that are only eating plants, we would find that there's only about 10% of energy. If we added all those organisms up, gathered them together, and figured out how much energy was contained in their bodies, it would only be about 10% of the energy that was contained in the trophic level below. And then if we went one layer above that, which is the third level in the trophic system, or like the second level consumers, they are the organisms that are eating the plants. So that might be like a shrew or something that eats insects. That organism, if we gathered all those organisms that live in the field together, we would find that they would contain only 10% of the energy from the level below, and so on and so forth, which is of course why there's so many fewer big like carnivores out on the landscape than there are herbivores, and then there's even fewer, or there's even more like plants, and so on and so forth. So this is because of this 10% rule. So in this case, we're looking at it in terms of energy, but we could also think about it in terms of mass as well. So if we added up, clipped all the grasses and all the flowers out from the meadow and weighed it, and then weighed all the insects, and then weighed all the organisms that eat the insects, and then weighed all the organisms that eat the organisms that eat the insects, we would find that there would only be about 10%, or there'd be about 10% of the mass in each trophic level compared to the trophic level below. So if we had 1,000 kilograms of plants, we might only have 100 kilograms of insects and 10 kilograms of different kinds of insectivores and shrews, and 1 kilogram of something like a snake. So out on the meadow, you're not going to see a lot of rattlesnakes. You're going to see a lot more mice and rodents. You're going to see a lot more insects, and you're going to see a whole lot of grass out there. And that's because of this 10% efficiency rule. Okay, so we said this energy and mass conversion is not particularly efficient. About 90% is lost in each transfer between these different trophic level compartments. But the ecological efficiency does vary from system to system. So ecological efficiency is a term that refers to how much energy in particular is able to be transferred from one trophic level to the next. And remember, we know on average that's about 10%. But there are variations. So in general, aquatic systems are much more efficient versus terrestrial systems. So one of the reasons for that is that a lot of the organisms in aquatic systems are cold-blooded animals rather than hot-blooded animals. So they don't waste nearly as much energy trying to stay at like 98.6 degrees, right? Which is how hot humans are. So they don't waste energy in that way. So they can pass energy more efficiently. Also, aquatic animals aren't fighting gravity all the time, so they're not wasting energy that way. And so there tend to be lots more levels in aquatic ecosystems compared to terrestrial ecosystems. So like in our terrestrial ecosystem here, we just had like 4 levels: plants, consumers, second level consumers, third level consumers. Whereas in aquatic ecosystems, you might have like 12 levels where there's really tiny plankton, and then there's bigger plankton eating smaller plankton, and even bigger plankton eating those, and then tiny fish, and then bigger fish, and so on and so forth. So because it's so efficient, it allows for these much longer trophic systems or much longer food chains. But this also means when we think about efficiency in food production, that fish can actually, when done right and fished sustainably, can actually be potentially much more sustainable food sources than raising terrestrial organisms in some cases. Now, with a huge caveat, which is that we do not fish most fish in sustainable ways. We over harvest fish. So that's that's a human problem. But the ecological system that fish are a part of is potentially very efficient. So if we can recreate that in different kinds of aquaculture systems, et cetera, that aren't too polluting and aren't too damaging to ecosystems, that could be a potential way to produce lots of food very efficiently. So speaking of human diet, we know that the higher up we're eating on the food chain, the more mass and energy has been lost along the way to produce that food. So for instance, domestic meat animals are bred for ecological efficiency. So they're in many cases going to be more efficient at capturing energy compared to the average 10% rule that we talked about before. And in particular, smaller organisms like chicken, and then we said fish already, are more efficient than bigger animals like pigs or cattle or sheep. So for example, if we had a certain amount of grain and we were going to feed it to an animal, we could either eat 1 gram of kilogram or 1 kilogram of wheat, which is about 2 pounds of wheat. So like make a 2-pound loaf of bread with that and get that like straight amount of energy and mass from that food source. Or we could use about 1.5 kilograms of grain and feed it to fish to get 1 kilogram. So we'd lose a little bit of the mass and energy by trying to eat fish instead of just eating that grain. If we wanted to eat a small bird, like a chicken, we'd probably have to feed it about twice that amount. So 2 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of chicken. So we're losing half of the food by turning it from grain into chicken. For pork, we would have to feed pigs about 6 kilograms of grain to get 1 kilogram of pork. So we could feed 6 people grain or 1 person pork in that same quantity. And then the larger the animal, usually the less efficient it is. So cattle are the least efficient. You would have to probably feed them about 7 kilograms of grain to get 1 kilogram of beef. So if you're in a system where you're feeding these domestic animals grain that you're growing somewhere else, that's a pretty inefficient system. Now, there's lots of places in the world, including places in the United States, where we're not producing domestic livestock by feeding them grain. They're out eating native grasses and grasslands that really aren't suitable for agriculture. So that presents an opportunity to produce meat much more efficiently. But when we're thinking about just kind of straight up the efficiency of eating meat in a general ecological system where we're feeding them grain products that are produced to make meat, this is not an ecologically efficient way to go about doing this. So anyway, meat tissue basically always requires much, much more energy, not to mention much, much more water and other things to produce compared to eating lower down on the food chain like vegetables or grain. So as a caveat, I'm not a vegetarian, but it's an interesting concept to think about. Okay, so when we're thinking about these distinct trophic levels, I think it's an important additional caveat to mention that, of course, food chains are never that simple. Ecological systems are usually very complex, where there's lots of different ways that energy can move through the system. So for instance, grass is not only going to be eaten by a deer, but grass could be eaten by a mouse or a deer or an insect that might be eaten by any number of different organisms, and organisms can sometimes occupy multiple trophic levels. So organisms like humans, we can eat primary producers, or we can eat consumers, or we can eat secondary consumers. So, you know, just ecological complexity is a real thing, which makes the world interesting. That makes these really clean cut distinctions between trophic levels complicated. And I think that's a good place to stop before we get into nutrient cycling.